The Guggenheim Museum in New York is one of those rare buildings that enters architectural history not just simply as a great work, but as a provocation. The provocation is a simple, singular idea. It proposes that a museum is not a neutral container for art. It proposes that the museum itself can be an experience with its own logic and its own choreography, even its own tempo. It proposes its own argument about how viewing art should happen. The story begins with Wright, but in interaction with Hille von Rebay, an artist and an aristocrat who was the first director of the Guggenheim's early museum project, who wanted a permanent home for Solomon R. Guggenheim's collection of non-objective modern art. In a June 1st, 1943 letter to Wright, she makes the request in language that's almost theatrical. She says she needs a fighter and a lover of space, and she asks for a temple of spirit, a monument. That phrase, temple of spirit, is important because it licenses Wright to treat the museum not as a machine for hanging pictures and all the efficiency that would mean, but as a modern interior with an almost civic, almost religious power, a space that makes people feel something about modern art before they even understand it. The commission is formally dated to 1943, and from that moment, right from the start, it's framed as a rejection of ordinary museum architecture. Wright is already an old man when he gets this job. He will be in his late 70s and 80s through much of the design process. And the location amplifies this drama. This is Fifth Avenue, the edge of Central Park, the Museum Mile, the zone of polite cultural authority. It is not the landscape of Falling Water or the desert world of Taliesin West. This is the city at its most public and at its most judgmental. Wright's response is to invent a building that refuses to behave like the museum next door. Instead of a sequence of rectangular rooms, he proposes a single continuous space, a great interior void wrapped by a spiraling ramp under a luminous skylit dome. Even people who dislike the building tend to remember the same thing first: the ramp, the spiral, the sense that you are moving through a work of architecture before you are looking at art. The museum's long gestation is part of its meaning. This is not a project Wright solves instantly and builds. This building is unique in Wright's work in that over the 16-year period between 1943 and the museum's 1959 opening, the design is revised repeatedly, yet the essential spiral idea stays intact. Archival accounts describe the process as producing multiple sets of construction drawings and around 700 sketches as Wright keeps adjusting the project to the program, to the budget, and to the structural realities. By 1945, Wright and Rebay are already managing the museum as a public spectacle. The design is unveiled to the press at a luncheon at the Plaza Hotel in July 9th, 1945, and models become crucial because ordinary drawings can't easily communicate a building with almost no right angles and few parallel surfaces. Wright writes that the model will save us many thousands of dollars because it clarifies doubtful points instantly. These early models also reveal how ambitious and how strange Wright's vision was even at the very beginning. The 1945 model differs from the building as built. For example, it included a grand dome-like roof idea and a spherical glass observatory atop the elevator shaft. And even the site itself wasn't settled in the way a normal project would be. The footprint of the adjacent parcels evolve, and Wright revises the design once the full site is purchased by 1951, so the museum can extend to 89th Street. The key experiential idea, though, remains consistent. The museum is, from the outset, a path. Wright did not imagine visitors climbing up the ramp as a kind of architectural workout. He wanted the elevator to take you to the top, and then you would descend slowly down the spiral, letting the art unfold in sequence, while the building holds you in a continuous spatial sentence. That is a radical claim about museum going because it turns the act of looking into a single choreographed walk. Most museums train you to move from room to room, turning corners, doubling back, maybe even retracing your steps. But Wright wants something very, very different, maybe even closer to inevitability. One continuous descent, one unbroken interior, a quarter-mile of ramp, wrapped around a central rotunda. Wright even flirts with making circulation itself into a more complex machine. For a time, the design includes not only the grand ramp, we all know, but also a second, steeper, quick ramp meant to move people faster between levels, more than twice as steep, almost a slide, as a later commentary puts it. By 1955, that quick ramp is abandoned and replaced by the museum's distinctive triangular stair. So why did this building generate so much resistance? Because its brilliance is inseparable from its aggression. The Guggenheim refuses neutrality. It demands that paintings and sculpture submit to the curved walls, outward tilting surfaces, and continuously sloped floor. It turns the gallery wall into something which is not a passive background and more like a spatial condition with its own personality. You don't step into a room and contemplate. You keep moving. The building keeps reminding you you are inside its path. And that is exactly what alarmed many artists. In 1956, a group of artists sent a protest letter to the museum's then director, James Johnson Sweeney, objecting to Wright's design. The letter survives in the archives of American art at the Smithsonian, and the signatories are a who's who of mid-century American painting and sculpture. Names like Willem de Kooning, Robert Motherwell, Philip Guston, Franz Klein, and Adolf Gottlieb, among others. The protest points to a fundamental tension that never goes away with the Guggenheim. Is the museum an instrument for the art, or does the museum compete with the art? That question was present from the beginning, and it becomes even sharper as the leadership changes. Docomomo's register notes that after Rebbe, Sweeney made numerous changes to Wright's plan prior to the 1959 opening, and that's evidence of a long institutional struggle over how far Wright's vision should be allowed to go. Sweeney fights with Wright, but doesn't last a year. But then comes the final irony. Wright does not live to see the opening. The museum opens on October 21st, 1959, and contemporary accounts describe crowds lining up outside this bizarrely shaped white concrete form, admired, mocked, argued over, immediately absorbed into New York's public theater. Wright dies on April 9th, 1959, about 6 months earlier, so the building opens as a posthumous statement, the last major monument of his career arriving without him there to defend it in person. And perhaps that is why the Guggenheim's meaning has stayed unstable, in a productive way, for decades. On the one hand, it becomes one of the most recognizable museum buildings on Earth, a piece of architectural branding as powerful as any logo. But on the other hand, it never fully stops being controversial because it never pretends to be a polite container. Even sympathetic summaries admit the central charge. The building can feel less about the art and more about Frank Lloyd Wright. So if you want the Guggenheim's place in Wright's larger story, it's this. Fallingwater proves Wright can make a house into a masterpiece of modern form fused with nature. Taliesin West proves he can build a living architectural culture around apprenticeship and place. The Guggenheim proves something much more combative. Wright can take on the capital city of cultural authority, invent a new museum type, and force the public to argue about what modern architecture is allowed to do. In 1932, New York's Museum of Modern Art tried to define modernism as a legible international style. But in 1959, Wright's Guggenheim arrives like a counter-definition. Modernism as an interior experience, a continuous promenade, and a temple of spirit that refuses to behave like anyone else's museum.